chance to sign in? Okay, cool. Please do that if you haven't. I'll leave it up for a second. Okay, so just some quick announcements. Again, my office hours are 10 to 11 in the Academic Achievement Center on Fridays. Email me if you have any questions, concepts, problems you want me to go over, or even if you just have a question that you want me to answer, I can answer it for you. And also, my notes are now available on Husky CT under the notes folder. I just wanted to say like how these are broken down. So there's one like really big doc with all the notes from like that I took from the lecture videos. Yeah, so that's like broken down by exam. And then there's another document that just has a list of terms. And this terms list I created like while I was studying. I'd go through and just kind of like put down the basic terms for each concept just to review. So that's like kind of a cohesive list of stuff that you have to know, but like don't take it like as it is. But I think that would be a really helpful thing to just kind of go over and be like, okay, I understand like the organization of all the terms and I have everything down and I know what everything means. Yeah, so that's kind of how those documents are broken down if you use them. So this week we're on the peripheral nervous system, which is just like the sensory neurons from your extremities rather than just the brain and the spinal cord from the central nervous system that we went over last week. This is just a quick aside. The cranial nerves, I don't think you have to know for lecture. I could be wrong, but you definitely have to know them for lab, for the practical. So this is a chart that I made when I took the course. If you want to reference it, I just put it in the slides. Study tip is to make acronyms. You guys have definitely done that before, but just a reminder because I always forget that that's a good way to study. So mine are on there. They probably don't make sense, but they're made if you want an acronym for the cranial nerves. Okay, so just to recap, like I just said, central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system is the sensory receptors. So that's just like anything that your body is taking in. The peripheral nervous system is taking it in from the extremities and sending that information to the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then those are just some terms that we went over last week to define parts of the neuron in each system. Okay, so there are two divisions of the peripheral nervous system. First is the general or somatic sensation division. And this is just basically what it sounds like in general, like the senses that you have, like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and your conscious or subconscious. Special sensations are more like they're on your face pretty much. So it's vision, hearing, olfaction, which is smell, and gustation, which is taste. And these all have special pathways or receptors that we're going to go over. But yeah, so general sensations versus the special sensations. And then you have three main different sensory receptors that take in stimuli from the environment. Well, they're put into three main categories, and they can fall into like any of the three categories. So first, these sensory receptors are classified by their function, and then their location and their structure. And I'm going to go into each of these on the next slides. So the first way a sensory receptor can be classified is by its function. And this is based on the adequate stimulus or modality that it receives information for. So that sounds complicated, but it's really not, because an adequate stimulus or modality is just the type of information it encodes. So to break that down further, a functional classification is based on the type of information it encodes, which is also known as the adequate stimulus or modality. And the adequate stimulus is the amount and type of energy required to stimulate a specific sensory organ. So if you look at that term, adequate is kind of like means good enough, and then stimulus would like activate it. So there are 5 different functional classifications that are listed on this slide. And something else important to note is that each sensory receptor can only register information from one of these functional classifications. So if you have a stimulus, for example, that is both hot and painful, one neuron will only register, if it's a thermoreceptor, it'll only be like, that's hot. Whereas if it's a pain receptor, it'll only know that it's painful. Like you can't have a neuron that senses multiple of the functional classifications. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So you have thermal receptors that are sensitive to temperature. Mechanoreceptors are sensitive to mechanical stimuli, and these have encapsulated nerve endings. Nociceptors, which I might have spelled wrong, are sensitive to pain. Photoreceptors, sensitive to light, and chemoreceptors are sensitive to different chemicals, like calcium. The second classification is based on location, which is pretty straightforward. So you have the exteroreceptors, which sense the external environment. So if I'm touching the table, then the sensory receptors in my finger are known as exteroreceptors because they're sensing the external environment. Interoreceptors sense the internal environment. So an example of one of these might be a neuron or other sensory receptor in your gut that might be like sensing changes in pH or chemicals when you're digesting food. That might send like signals to like activate different digestive responses. So they're sensing a change in the internal environment. Proprioreceptors sense the change in the body's position. So like if you're on a roller coaster and you're upside down, like you know you're upside down, and that's the proprioreceptors. And they're located in muscles and joints. Oh, that should be 3, but structural classification is the third. So this is basically based on obviously the structure of the sensory receptor. So the first 2 are neurons. So free nerve endings are dendritic cells embedded in tissue. So if you remember, that's like the front of the neuron that receives the signal and then sends it down the axon to the axon terminal. So the dendritic cell is in the tissue and it senses pain, temperature, or smell, and those are unmyelinated. So they're free nerve endings, so they don't have myelin, they're free. You can remember it that way. Encapsulated nerve endings are pretty much the same thing, but they're in connective tissue and they're myelinated, and they also are for mechanoreceptors, which is pressure and touch. And then 2 sensory receptors for special senses are rods and cones, which are photoreceptors for sight in the back of your eye, and those are myelinated. And then you have hair cells in your ear for hearing. And the hair cells in your ear basically just like sense the vibrations of like auditory speech, and then they vibrate, and then that like sends signals to other neurons that then transmit the signal to your brain. So that's how that works. So the peripheral nervous system, the pathway that starts from it, is known as the afferent pathway. So this is the sensory pathway. If you remember from last week, we were talking about the efferent pathway, which sends information from your brain out to your body to like respond to a stimulus, whereas the afferent pathway is sending information like from your extremities up to your brain so your brain can perceive the stimulus. So the general path is from the neuron in your peripheral tissue, basically to the spine, to the dorsal root, to the dorsal root ganglion, to the dorsal gray horn, and then it depends on the tract where the signal goes next. Then you have some definitions here. The spinal nerve is where afferent and efferent nerves separate. The dorsal root ganglion is where cell bodies of afferent neurons go. And another note is that afferent neurons are unipolar, which means that their cell bodies are in the middle of the axon, and the cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglion of the afferent neurons. So the afferent pathway can be broken down into 3 neurons. So the first neuron is the first order neuron, and this connects the peripheral tissue to the central nervous system. So if you feel something, again, this neuron is basically going to transmit that signal up your arm to the spinal cord. The second order neuron is where decussation occurs, which is crossing over. And this is responsible for contralateral control. So as I didn't talk about it last week, but in lecture last week, you talked about how the brain is split into 2 lobes, right? And how the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. Do you guys remember that? Okay. Yeah, so it's basically the same for sensory information. If I touch something with the left side of my body, it's going to travel to my spinal cord, go up to my brain, and be registered by the right side of my brain. So we're going to learn about 2 specific sensory pathways, and where the crossing over occurs in the central nervous system is a very big discrepancy between the 2 pathways, but we'll go over that. In the second order neuron, synapses or ends in the thalamus, and this is where sensory information is filtered. And the third order neuron goes from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex, where the body or the brain perceives the stimulus. So this is a lot of writing, but I wanted to put them both on one slide so you could have like a direct comparison of the 2 pathways. So we'll just go through it. The first one is the dorsal column pathway. This is a white matter afferent tract in the posterior spine. And then the other pathway is the spinothalamic pathway. So the spinothalamic pathway senses pain and temperature. And a way to remember that is like spinothalamic pathway sounds kind of like spiny. So it's like pain and temperature. That's what it senses. So that can kind of help you keep them straight. And then the dorsal column pathway is for fine touch and proprioception. And then each of the 2 pathways has 2 different tracks, and these basically just describe where they're getting their sensory information from in the body. So if you look at the dorsal column pathway, you have the fasciculus cunatus, which carries sensory information from the upper body, and then the fasciculus gracilis carries sensory information from the lower body. So that's just something to memorize. And then in the spinothalamic pathway, you have the anterior spinothalamic pathway, which carries information from the upper body, and the lateral carries information from the lower body. So what that means is like if I had a painful stimulus in my upper body, like my shoulder, it would be that the stimulus would get to my brain via the anterior spinothalamic pathway. And then these slides just break down specifically for each pathway what the 3 neurons that we talked about before are doing. So they're pretty much very similar, but you have to just note where decussation occurs. So in the dorsal column pathway, crossing over occurs in the medulla, which is in your brainstem. So that means we're going to go back to this example, fine touch. If I'm just touching the table, the signal is going to go up my left arm to the left side of the spinal cord, travel up my spinal cord on the left side, and then cross over in my brain, in the medulla, and then be registered by the right side of my brain. In the spinothalamic pathway, crossing over occurs in the spinal cord at the same level that the stimulus was received. So instead, if I had a painful stimulus on the left side of my body, it would travel to the spinal cord, cross over right away, and travel up the spinal cord on the right side of my body. That's basically what that means. And they both meet in the thalamus and then go to the somatosensory cortex to be perceived. So this is what we just talked about, the big difference between the 2 pathways, where crossing over occurs, and then what type of sensory information each pathway is receiving. So the dorsal pathway, again, is sensing fine touch and proprioception, where the spinothalamic pathway is sensing pain and temperature. And then I just have a little note that the spine is spiny, so it senses pain and temperature. And then here's a diagram of what we just said. So the dorsal column pathway crosses over in the spinal cord where the in the medulla, while the spinothalamic passes over in the spinal cord. And then you guys go over 2 special senses this unit. So the first one is vision, and then you also do hearing. And these basically just describe how, like, for vision, for example, the stimuli that you see is being transmitted to the brain and how your brain registers it, and then how you're actually, like, hearing what you're hearing by getting senses in your brain. That's what. Okay, so the next few slides are very anatomy heavy. I basically just put my notes on all the definitions that you need to know for each system on the slide so you can reference it. So you have the outer fibrous layer, inner vascularized layer, the deep nervous layer. So in the outer fibrous layer, you have the cornea and sclera. The cornea is tough connective tissue, and then the sclera is just the white of your eye. Vascularized layer, the iris is just the colored part of your eye, and the choroid is where you have a bunch of blood vessels. Deep nervous layer. So the retina is important. It contains photoreceptors and neurons that become part of the optic nerve. And then the sensory receptors are in the retina. Those are the rods and cones. The rods don't sense color, but they sense shapes. And then the cones sense color. And the fovea is another region that has the highest density of cones. Then bipolar cells are little neurons that form synapses between the rods and cones and ganglion cells. So they take the information from the rods and cones and send them to ganglion cells. Horizontal and amacrine cells integrate information between the photoreceptors, between the rods and the cones, and then the ganglion cells carry the information from the bipolar cells to form the optic nerve. Yeah, so that's kind of a lot, but these are available for you to look at. And then this is just the path of light through the eye. The cornea is first, it helps to bend the light, and then you have the aqueous humor, which is a fluid that's at the front part of the eye. The lens changes shape to focus on objects by bending the light. And when it's expanded, it's focusing light on closer objects, and when it's flattened, it's focusing on objects far away. And it does this by using its elastin fibers. And then you have a second fluid in the eye, and this fills like the big portion of the eye, whereas the aqueous humor just fills like between the cornea and the lens. The vitreous humor fills like most of the eye, and it helps to hold everything in place and bend the light. And then at the back of the eye, you have the fovea and the retina with all the photoreceptors. Okay, so I used to work at an optometrist office, so I thought this was cool to put up here. This is what you see when you get like a picture taken of your retina. So that's the optic nerve, then that's the fovea with like the cones concentrated. And also something else that's cool is you can detect a lot of like pathologies from just looking at the back of your eye, like high blood pressure and diabetes and stuff. So that's just a little application I thought was cool. Okay, back to the path of sensory information to the brain. So there are two neurons that sense the information from your eye that are sending the information back to your brain. So the medial ganglion axons cross over in the optic chiasm. So the axons that are receiving information from on the middle part of your eye cross over, whereas the lateral ganglion axons stay on the same side and do not cross over. So then the next bullet is just basically saying that like information from both eyes is processed on both sides of the brain, and it's not like a strict contralateral system for your eyes. And then the signal travels to the superior colliculi, which is on the midbrain, where visual reflexes are processed. So I'm not sure if you guys talked about that yet, but reflexes are sometimes processed in the spinal cord, and then your body automatically like responds to them without the information getting to your brain. Same thing with your eyes, like visual reflexes before getting to the back of the occipital lobe are processed in the superior colliculi, and then you can like reflex without even really like registering what you're seeing. And then the information goes to your thalamus and then to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe, where the information is processed and we see the stimuli. Okay, so this is a drawing of the path of sensory information from your eyes to the brain. So, like we talked about, the lateral ganglion cells do not cross over, whereas the medial ones do cross over, as you can see. And also, the lateral ganglion cells, so the ganglions on the lateral or outside of your eye are viewing kind of like the middle of your vision, whereas the medial ganglions are perceiving information from your peripheral vision. So it's kind of opposite, if that makes sense. If you look at the image, it's a little bit more clear. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. And then to focal disorders, they're disorders of focusing on objects. So myopia is also known as nearsighted, and you can see things up close but not far away. So a way to remember this is myopia, you can see me, which is kind of like near you. I mean, not right now, but and if you have myopia, you have an expanded lens or a long eye, which causes the focal point to be anterior or in front of the fovea. So if you look at the image down there, you can see that the light is focusing like in front of where the rods and cones are. So your lens like isn't like bending the light in the right way to hit directly on the rods and cones. It's focusing the light in front of the rods and cones. And then hyperopia is farsighted, so it's the opposite. You can see things that are far away but not up close. And this is when you have a flat lens or a short eye. So it's causing the light to be focused too far from the retina. So it's behind the rods and cones instead of being focused right on the rods and cones. So I guess a lot of old people get hyperopia, and you can correct it with a curved lens. So then here's just the hearing or the ear anatomy. Again, like there's a lot on this slide. So it's broken down into the external, middle, and inner ear. And I'll kind of let you guys go over this yourself because I feel like me reading just like all the information off the slide isn't very helpful. But something to note is pitch. And pitch is determined by the frequency of the sound waves. So a higher pitch will have more frequent sound waves, and the little hairs in your ear can like sense that it has a higher frequency. And then here's a diagram of the anatomy of the ear. Okay, so like I say every week, I recommend to make a condensed study guide. Mine is on the slide if you want to like blow it up and use it, but I also recommend that you make your own just because it really helps with studying. Okay, I have a few questions. If a retinal detachment occurs on the medial side of the left eye, what part of the visual field would be impacted? So what side and what is it, medial or periphery? Okay, what side? Yes, you're right. But I'm going to give everyone a minute because I feel like they're thinking about it. Does anyone have a guess? Yeah.
Left periphery.
Yeah. Do you know why?
Like the light goes like that.
Yeah. So, medial side of the left eye, medial senses, peripheral vision, and there's no crossing over because we're not talking about like reception of the signal. It's more just like what you're seeing. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. I took these first few questions off a top hat. I don't know if you guys have done them. Have you guys done these yet? You did do this one? Okay. Well, we'll just go over it really quickly then. Okay, so there's damage to the right side of the spinal cord, impacting the spinothalamic pathway. How does the damage impact Muhammad's ability to perceive the stimuli? So what sensory information does damage to this pathway impact, and what side of the body does he lose this sensation? So let's start with the first part. What sensory information does damage to this pathway impact? Yeah.
Mainly temperature.
Yeah. And then what side of the body would he lose the sensation? Does anyone know? The left. Let me double check before I confirm or deny. Yeah. Okay, so it's on the left side of the body because crossing over occurs in the spinal cord. So damage to one side of the spinal cord would affect sensation on the opposite side of the body. If we were talking about the dorsal pathway, then damage to one side of the spinal cord would affect the same side of the body because crossing over is in the brain. Chantel has damage on the right side of her spinal cord. Oh, I just said this. Impacting the dorsal column pathway. How does the damage impact Chantel's ability to perceive the stimuli? So what senses would she lose and on what side of the body? Does anyone have a guess? Yeah.
I was gonna say since it's the dorsal column, that side it doesn't like flip. So since she has damage on the right side, it would affect like any like I don't know what the dorsal does, but anything that is on the right side,
Yeah.
she won't be able to like perceive it to like get the symbol.
Yeah, that was a good explanation. So since it crosses over in the brain, anything on the right side of the body would have trouble like perceiving. and its dorsal column. So it's loss of fine touch and proprioception on the right side of the body. And then that's all I have for you guys. So you can ask me any questions after if you want. Or does anyone have any questions now? Okay, cool, yeah. So feel free to email me.